She insulted an ordinary customer only to realize he owned the place, and was Al Pacino. The midday sun poured through the large windows of Sierra Grill, a modest yet lively restaurant in Carmel by the Sea, California. It wasn't a high-end spot, but it had a charm of its own, a little rustic, a little modern, the kind of place locals cherished, especially on a warm Thursday afternoon. For Megan, a 23-year-old waitress struggling to make ends meet, charm wasn't enough to ease her frustration. Her shift had been a whirlwind of chaos since she'd clocked in. "Table 7 needs extra dressing," a fellow server called out. Megan didn't even glance up as she hurriedly scribbled the latest order onto her notepad. Her ponytail swayed as she moved swiftly between tables, juggling complaints about undercooked steaks, split checks, and forgotten drink orders. To make matters worse, 3 particularly rude customers had stiffed her on tips in the past hour, leaving nothing but a few coins as an afterthought. By the time an elderly man in his 80s strolled in and quietly took a seat at a corner table, Megan was already on edge. He didn't look like someone who cared much for appearances. His slightly wrinkled flannel shirt, faded jeans, and a well-worn Stetson resting on the table gave him a laid-back, unassuming look. His boots told a story of decades spent walking dusty roads. Megan shot him a quick once-over, her lips curling into a faint smirk. "Great," she muttered under her breath. "Another one who's probably going to order a coffee and leave me $1. Still, she couldn't ignore him forever. "You've got table 12, her coworker nudged her. Megan sighed, grabbed her notepad, and plastered on her best fake smile as she approached. "What can I get you today?" she asked, her tone laced with impatience. The man looked up, his sharp eyes scanning her face for a moment. There was something strikingly familiar about him, but Megan couldn't quite place it. "Just a burger," he said calmly. His voice was low, gravelly, and carried an undeniable weight, one that seemed to demand respect without asking for it. "Burger, got it. Anything else?" Megan asked, her pen tapping against the notepad. "No, ma'am." He tipped his hat slightly. Megan rolled her eyes as she walked back toward the kitchen, muttering under her breath. "Ma'am? Really?" Yet as she stepped through the kitchen doors, a strange feeling gnawed at her. Something about him stood out. Unlike the other customers who were often rude, demanding, or dismissive, he carried himself with quiet confidence. It was as if he was observing, waiting for something. Megan shook it off. Just another table, another order, another $1. She had no idea how wrong she was. Minutes later, she returned to table 12, placing his burger down with a bit less care than usual. Running on fumes, her forced smile barely held up. If the man noticed her attitude, he didn't show it. "Here you go," Megan said, brushing a strand of hair from her face as she set a ketchup bottle next to his plate. "Anything else?" The man glanced at the burger, then back at her. "No, this looks just fine. Thank you." His words were polite, but the firm tone made Megan feel oddly self-conscious. She lingered for a moment, unsure why. She hadn't moved on to the next table yet. Something about his demeanor irritated her. Maybe it was the way he remained so calm, unshaken, while the rest of the restaurant buzzed with complaints, snapping fingers, and frantic movement. But not him. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked abruptly, leaning against the edge of his table. She couldn't help herself. "No, I'm not," he replied simply, slicing his burger in half with precise, deliberate movements. "Thought so," she smirked. "The hat gave it away. Looks like you just stepped out of an old Western movie." For the first time, the man smiled. It wasn't a full grin, just a faint curve of his lips. "Something like that," he said. Megan expected him to get defensive, maybe annoyed, but he didn't. That only frustrated her more. She was tired of being polite, tired of holding back her thoughts. Leaning in slightly, she lowered her voice as if sharing a secret. "You know," she said, "most people around here don't show up looking like they just came from a ranch." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a slow, measured bite of his burger, chewing thoughtfully. Then after a moment, he finally spoke. "I guess I'm not most people." The words were simple, but they carried a weight Megan didn't expect. She felt a flicker of embarrassment just for a second, before shoving it down. "Well, enjoy your meal," she said quickly, pushing herself off the table and walking away. Before he could say anything else, she was sure she'd gotten the last word, but as she cleared a nearby table, she felt his gaze on her. Not in a creepy way, but with an expression that made her feel like she was being evaluated, judged even. It was unsettling, and she couldn't figure out why it bothered her so much. But something about that look would soon change the course of her day and her life in ways she never saw coming. The lunch rush finally began to die down, and the restaurant grew quieter. Megan let out a breath, grateful for the break. She leaned against the counter, scrolling through her phone while keeping an eye on her tables. Her gaze flicked to table 12. The man was finishing his meal, and something told her this wasn't over yet. He wasn't in any hurry, sipping his water, glancing around the restaurant with quiet curiosity. "Hey, Megan," her coworker Danny said as she walked past. "Isn't it weird how calm that guy is? Like he's just taking it all in." Megan shrugged. "Yeah, well, some people have all the time in the world." Danny chuckled. "Maybe he's famous or something. He looks familiar, doesn't he?" Megan rolled her eyes. "Famous? Yeah, right. If he's famous, then I'm the Queen of England." Danny raised an eyebrow but didn't push further. Megan wasn't in the mood for pointless guessing games. Instead, she grabbed the check for table 12 and walked over, determined to keep things brief. "Here's your check," she said, placing it on the table with a faint smile. "Whenever you're ready." The man glanced at the check but didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, his sharp eyes lifted to meet hers. "Do you enjoy your job?" he asked, his voice calm yet deliberate. The question caught Megan off guard. She hesitated, her practiced smile faltering. "It's fine," she said with a shrug. "It's a job, you know?" He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "A job's what you make of it," he said after a moment. "But it seems like you're carrying a lot today." Megan felt her cheeks heat up. Who was he to comment on her attitude? She crossed her arms. "Look, I've had a rough shift, okay? Not everyone gets to sit around eating burgers and handing out life advice." To her surprise, the man didn't seem offended. Instead, he leaned back slightly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Fair enough," he said. "But sometimes, how you treat people in those moments says more about you than you think." A flicker of irritation rose in Megan's chest. Was he lecturing her? She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, he stood up, reaching into his pocket for his wallet. "I'll leave you with that thought," he said, placing a few bills on the table. "Thanks for the meal." As he walked toward the door, Megan muttered under her breath, "Yeah, whatever, cowboy." But just as he reached the exit, something unexpected happened. Carol, the manager, a no-nonsense woman who rarely showed emotion, hurried out from the back office. Her face lit up the moment she spotted the man. "Mr. Pacino, I wasn't expecting you today," she said, her voice filled with genuine respect. Megan froze. Her stomach dropped. Her mind raced. "Pacino? Al Pacino?" Her head snapped toward the door, eyes widening as she saw him pause, turning back just briefly to shake Carol's hand. And then, just for a second, his gaze caught hers. A knowing look passed between them, and then he was gone. And in that moment, Megan realized everything had just changed. She hadn't just brushed off some random customer. She had insulted the owner of the restaurant. Megan stood frozen, her notepad clutched tightly in her hand. She stared at the door Al Pacino had just walked through, her mind racing. Had she really just dismissed Al Pacino? The Al Pacino, and not only that, he owned the restaurant. Her heart pounded as Carol turned toward her, waving her over. "Megan," she called, beaming. "Can you believe it? Mr. Pacino stopped by today. I haven't seen him in weeks. He's been so busy." Yeah, that's... wow." Megan's voice barely rose above a whisper. Carol didn't notice her discomfort. She was too busy gushing. "You know, this place means the world to him. He's so hands-on. Every detail here is something he's personally approved. That's why we always remind the staff, bring your best. You never know when he'll stop by." Megan felt like the, air had been sucked out of the room. She replayed every word she'd said to him, every snarky remark, every eye roll. Her cheeks burned with humiliation. "You okay?" Danny asked, eyeing her pale face. I think I need a minute." Megan didn't wait for a response. She hurried to the break room, shut the door behind her, and collapsed into a chair. How could she have been so oblivious? She'd worked at Sierra Grill for 2 years, and in all that time she'd never once paid attention to the stories about the mysterious owner. If she had, maybe she'd have recognized him. Maybe she would have thought twice before running her mouth. Her mind was spinning, but one thought stood out. What now? But Megan had no idea. Pacino wasn't done with her just yet. The next day, Megan arrived at work with a knot of anxiety twisting in her stomach. She hadn't slept. The events of the previous day played in her mind on repeat. Every time she thought about Al Pacino's calm demeanor, the way he looked at her before he walked out, she cringed. What if he told Carol about her attitude? What if she got fired? She couldn't afford to lose this job, not with rent due in 2 weeks and student loans piling up. For the first half of her shift, she did everything she could to stay under the radar. She avoided eye contact with Carol. She actually smiled at customers. She apologized if someone had to wait. She refilled drinks before anyone had to ask. It was the most effort she'd put into her job in months. By the time lunch rolled around, the restaurant was humming with activity. Megan was wiping down a table when she heard it, that unmistakable gravelly voice she hadn't been able to forget. "Well, looks like you're busy today." She turned sharply, her heart skipping a beat. Al Pacino stood near the counter, hands resting casually in his pockets. He was dressed much the same as the day before, but this time, his presence felt even more commanding. Megan's stomach twisted. She forced a nervous smile, scrambling for something to say. Mr. Pacino. Hi. I didn't expect you back so soon." He tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "I like to check in on my places from time to time. Keeps everyone on their toes." Megan swallowed hard, her palms damp. "Right. Well, everything's running great today." Pacino gave a small nod, glancing around the restaurant. "I see that, but you seem a little tense." She froze. Of course, he noticed. He probably noticed everything. "I just about yesterday." He held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "No need to apologize," he said calmly. "I'm not here to make your life harder." She blinked, caught off guard by his response. "You're not?" "No," he said, his voice steady. "But I do think there's a lesson here. You never know who you're talking to, or what they might be going through. A little kindness goes a long way." Megan's throat tightened. She didn't know how to respond, so she just nodded, feeling a lump form in her chest. "Look, I've had bad days too," Pacino continued, his tone softening. "But the way you handle those days says a lot about who you are. And trust me, people notice." Megan felt her face flush. His words weren't harsh, but they hit harder than any scolding ever could. He wasn't trying to embarrass her, he was trying to teach her something. "Thank you," she said quietly, barely above a whisper. "I mean it." Pacino gave her a small smile. "You're welcome. Just remember, every interaction's an opportunity. Use it well." With that, he tipped his hat and walked out. Megan stood there, overwhelmed with a mix of emotions, and for the first time in a long time, she felt something unexpected, the desire to be better. Over the next few weeks, Megan couldn't shake Pacino's words. They echoed in her mind every time she stepped onto the restaurant floor. Every interaction's an opportunity. Use it well. At first, she wasn't sure how to change. She wasn't the type to fake smiles or gush over customers like some of her coworkers, but something about Pacino's calm wisdom stuck with her. She didn't have to pretend to be someone else. She just had to show a little more patience, a little more care. So she started small. When a frazzled mom with 3 kids spilled a soda across the table, Megan didn't sigh or roll her eyes. Instead, she grabbed a rag, smiled, and said, "Don't worry, it happens to the best of us." When an elderly couple asked her to repeat the specials 3 times, she didn't let frustration show. She patiently explained them again, even adding her own recommendations. And the thing that surprised her most? The more effort she put into treating people kindly, the better she felt. One evening, near the end of her shift, Carol called Megan into the office. Megan's stomach twisted as she stepped inside, fearing the worst. "You've been working here for a while," Carol began, folding her hands on the desk. "And I've noticed a change in you lately. A good one." Megan blinked. "Oh, thank you." "I don't know what brought it on," Carol continued, "but whatever you're doing, keep it up. The customers have noticed too. One of them even left a comment card the other day praising your service." Megan felt a rush of pride and disbelief. She hadn't expected anyone to notice, let alone acknowledge it. As she left the office, a smile tugged at her lips. She still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was on the right path. That night, as she locked up the restaurant, her eyes flickered to the sign out front. It wasn't just a job anymore. It was a place where she could grow, learn, and maybe, just maybe, make a difference. And she owed it all to the quiet legend who had walked in one busy afternoon and taught her a lesson she'd never forget, because sometimes the smallest interactions have the biggest impact, and every moment is a chance to become someone better.